Wyoming Territory. Autumn of 1881. The wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder when Johnathan Cole pulled his dead brother from the dust. The body was still warm. The ambush had come fast, just east of Laramie, where the pines thinned and the hills rolled into open grassland. Johnathan crouched beside the bloodied shape of his older brother, Caleb, and stared at the bullet wound in his chest. No time for last words. No time for anything. He clenched his jaw, pulled the hat from Caleb's head, and set it gently over his face. Johnathan had buried men before. He had fought in the war, driven cattle through Comanche country, and watched friends bleed out in the mud. But this was his brother, the only family he had left. As he reached into Caleb's coat for the tin of matches, his fingers brushed paper. A folded letter, worn soft at the corners like it had been read more than once. He hesitated, then opened it. "Caleb, if you are still coming, I will wait at the homestead through the winter. The boys ask about you every day. I told them you would come. I do not need much. Just someone to stand beside me. I know I am not what you planned for, but I am still here." Georgia. Johnathan stared at the page until the words blurred. There was a second sheet, the one beneath it. This one was older, dated 3 months back. "Caleb, I understand if you have changed your mind. The boys have not seen their father in over a year. I will not beg, but they need someone. And so do I." Georgia. He folded both pages and slipped them into his pocket. His stomach turned cold. Caleb had never mentioned a woman. Never mentioned 2 boys waiting somewhere out west for a man who would not come. Johnathan stood, eyes sweeping the horizon. The men who did this were gone. He would track them later. First, he had a promise to keep. He saddled up and turned south. 3 days later, Johnathan rode into the Colorado plains, dust layering his hat and coat. He passed a wooden sign barely hanging from its post. Rivermouth Pop, 206. The town was little more than a general store, a boarding house, and a church with a tilted steeple. He asked the man unloading grain sacks at the store, "You know a woman named Georgia?" The man squinted. "You lookin' for Georgia Ryland? She's out past the orchard. Big place, whitewashed barn. 2 boys always runnin' around." Johnathan thanked him and rode on. He found the homestead half a mile out. The fields were patchy, fence half mended, but the house stood tall against the wind. A woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had a rifle leaned against the wall and eyes like a storm. She froze as he dismounted. "Georgia Ryland?" he asked. "Yes," she said slowly. "Who are you?" He took off his hat. "My name is Johnathan Cole. I am Caleb's brother." She stared at him for a long second. The wind tugged at her dark braid, dust curling around her boots. Then her face fell. "He is dead." "Yes," Johnathan said quietly. 3 days ago." Georgia stepped down from the porch, her shoulders tight. She looked away, jaw clenched. "I figured." He stopped writing. Johnathan reached into his coat and pulled out the letters. "I found these in his pocket. I thought you had a right to them." She took them with shaking hands, lips pressed tight. A sudden shout broke the silence. "Ma, look!" A boy, maybe 6, barefoot and grinning, ran from behind the house. A second followed, 2 years older, holding a wooden sword. Both had Caleb's eyes. The younger one barreled into Georgia's skirts. "Who is that, Ma? Is it Uncle Caleb?" Georgia's breath hitched. She crouched quickly and pulled both boys close. "No, sweetheart," she said. "This is his brother. This is Johnathan." The older boy studied him. "You look like him." Johnathan nodded. "And you must be Zachary and Zeke." The little one grinned. "I am Zachary." Johnathan managed a small smile. "Your father wanted to come. He tried." Georgia stood, face unreadable. "You should stay the night." "I still have his room." That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Georgia poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Johnathan on the porch. "Why did you come?" she asked. He stared into the dark fields. "Because I found those letters, because he should have made it, but he did not. And someone ought to stand where he meant to." She looked down at her cup. "I do not need saving." "I do not think you do," he said, "but maybe you could use someone to help mend that fence." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Fair enough. By the end of the week, Johnathan had repaired the west fence, broken the wild gelding in the corral, and taught Zachary how to hold a rope without tangling it around his legs. Georgia watched him quietly from the porch most evenings, her eyes softer than before. One night after supper, she stayed behind while the boys ran off to bed. "I keep waiting for you to leave," she said. Johnathan looked at her across the table. "I will not." She folded her hands. "You do not owe me anything." "I know," he said. "But I want to be here." She blinked like she had not expected that. "Why?" He stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. "Because I see the way you fight for those boys. Because I see how tired you are but keep going anyway. And because I think Caleb was a fool to keep you waiting." Her breath caught. Johnathan reached out, gently brushing a curl from her cheek. "Let me stay, not just for them, for you." Georgia looked at him, really looked, for the first time since he arrived, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was quiet and sure, like something that had waited long enough. From inside, Zachary's voice called, "Ma, can you tuck us in?" She pulled back, breathless but smiling. "That is your job now," she said, standing. Johnathan followed her inside. And for the first time since Caleb died, he felt like the world had tilted back into place. The first frost came overnight, turning the wind brittle and painting the pasture in silver light. Johnathan rose before dawn, boots crunching on stiff grass as he checked the livestock. The barn roof leaked in 2 places, and the south wall bowed slightly, but the horses were dry and the feed held out. He made a note to reinforce the beam with the extra pine he'd stacked behind the woodshed. Inside, the stove clattered with heat. Georgia was already at the table, sleeves rolled as she kneaded biscuit dough. Her hair was tied back with a red ribbon he hadn't seen before. "You always up this early?" he asked, brushing his hands clean by the door. "When I've got mouths to feed and floors to scrub," she said without looking up. He poured water into the basin, scrubbing the cold from his face. "I could take the boys into town today, if you need the house quiet." She paused, fingers pressing into the dough. "You do that? They've been eyeing that dry creek bed near the store. I figure they could use a ride and a little dirt." Georgia wiped her hands and leaned against the counter. "Zeke's been restless since the letter came. He won't say it, but he's trying to work out what it means that it was you who showed up, not Caleb." "I figured as much." Johnathan dried his face and met her eyes. "What would you want me to tell them?" "Only what's true," she said. "But not all at once." He nodded, then crossed the room and pulled on his coat. "We'll be back before supper." She stepped forward and caught his sleeve. "Wait." Her fingers tightened. "Zeke's got Caleb's temper. Don't let him talk you down just to see if you'll leave." "Wouldn't be the first boy to test me," Johnathan said. She let go, but her eyes lingered on his face a moment longer. "You're not him," she said, quiet. "But I'm starting to think you were meant to come here anyway." He said nothing, just tipped his hat and stepped out. By mid-morning, he had both boys bundled and saddled, Zeke riding beside him, Zachary half asleep across the saddle in front. The trail to town was lined with cottonwoods going bare, their bark white against the sky. Zeke watched the trees pass. "Did Pa ever tell you about us?" Johnathan kept his voice even. "No, I didn't know about you until I found the letters." Zeke's mouth pulled taut. "He could have come. He just didn't. I don't know what kept him, but I believe he meant to. That don't change anything." "No," Johnathan said, "but maybe it changes what comes next." Zeke didn't answer. At the general store, they traded eggs for molasses and a sack of flour. Zachary found a carved whistle in a barrel of trinkets and spent the next half-hour testing it while Johnathan made small talk with the shopkeeper. Zeke stood near the crates of nails, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Outside, Johnathan handed Zeke the reins. "You want to lead us back?" Zeke looked up, surprised. "You'd let me. You're near grown. You ought to know the way home." Zeke mounted up slow like it might be a trick, but he took the lead without another word and didn't look back once. That night, Georgia ladled stew into bowls while the wind picked up outside. The windows rattled softly in their frames. "Zeke was different when you came back," she said, passing a bowl to Johnathan. "Quieter but not sullen. He's finding his footing." She sat across from him, her hands cupped around her bowl. "He needs a man who'll stay, not just pass through." "I didn't come to pass through." She searched his face. "What did you come for then?" He didn't hesitate. "To finish what Caleb started, to build something that lasts, and maybe, if you'll let me, to be yours." Georgia looked down at her stew, then back up. "I've spent so long keeping things together with string and willpower. I forgot what it felt like to be looked at like that. You don't have to hold it all by yourself." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his knuckles. "Then stay. Winter's coming fast and I—" She stopped, breath catching. "I want you here, not just for the boys. For me." He turned his hand and held hers. "Then I'm yours, Georgia, for as long as you'll have me." Her voice came soft. "Then you'd better fix that barn wall. It's leaning like an old drunk." He laughed, the first real one in weeks, and her smile broke wide and honest. Outside, snow began to fall quiet and slow, blanketing the homestead in white. And inside, where the warmth held steady, something deeper settled in, sure as the land beneath their feet. The first real snow held through the week, crusting the pastures and bending the pine branches low. The mornings came gray, the sky heavy, and the woodpile dropped fast. On the fourth morning, Johnathan hitched the team and hauled a sled into the upper timberline, where fallen trunks lay thick from last spring's windstorm. Zeke rode with him, quiet for most of the climb. He held the reins as they reached the edge of the grove, eyes narrowed against the cold. "You ever cut timber before?" Johnathan asked, stepping down and reaching for the axe. Zeke nodded once. "Watched Uncle Hank do it. He'd wedge the back first to keep it from splitting wrong." Johnathan handed him the second axe. "Then let's get to it." The boy set his jaw and swung steady. They worked in rhythm, Johnathan leading, Zeke matching each stroke. By midday, their breath steamed in the air and a half-dozen trunks lay ready to haul. Zeke leaned on his axe. "Ma used to say Pa had shoulders like a barn door, said he could carry a hog under each arm." Johnathan straightened. "He was strong. But I think you'll pass him before long." Zeke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You believe she loved him." "I do. She didn't talk about him much, not even when he was still writing." Johnathan set the axe aside. "Some things hurt more when spoken aloud." "Doesn't mean she didn't feel them." Zeke nodded, slow. "I ain't mad he's gone, just don't know what to do with the space he left." "Fill it with something better," Johnathan said. "Build your own name." They looked out over the slope, the trees stretching down into blue shadow, and Zeke said nothing more. When they returned, the boys hauled the split wood inside while Georgia cleared space near the hearth. She dusted her palms on her skirt and gave Johnathan a brief glance that lingered longer than it might have a week ago. That evening, Georgia sat beside him on the bench near the fire, a worn mending basket in her lap. The boys were upstairs, the floor above creaking faintly as they settled into sleep. The wind had eased and the quiet wrapped around them like a wool blanket. "I sent a letter to my sister," Georgia said, threading a needle. "She's back in Missouri. Told her you were here." Johnathan tilted his head. You expecting her to object? No, she said, but I thought she ought to know. She always said I'd marry a man with a preacher's collar. I think she'll be surprised. Does that bother you? No, she said, glancing at him. I never wanted a man who made promises for a living. I wanted one who kept them. He looked at her hands, the way they moved with quiet certainty through the cloth. You ever think about leaving this place, starting somewhere new? She shook her head. I buried a child here, the first one. Didn't live past 2 weeks. He's under the cottonwood behind the barn. I won't leave him. Jonathan's breath caught. I didn't know. I don't talk about him, she said. Not because I forgot, but because grief settles different in a woman. We learn to carry it where it won't poison the rest. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You don't have to carry it alone. She reached for his hand, her fingers steady and warm. I know that now. They sat there a long while, the fire crackling low, her mending in her lap and his hand in hers. No more words passed between them before turning in, but something had changed. In the weeks that followed, the homestead took on a rhythm that felt like something larger than survival. Johnathan taught Zachary how to whittle without slicing skin, and Georgia read to them in the evenings from the tattered copy of Ivanhoe her mother had left behind. Zeke took to checking the traps before breakfast, boots crunching through frost as he returned with rabbits or pheasant, depending on luck. One morning, as the snow began to thaw, Georgia brought out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the table and unwrapped it to reveal a pale blue dress with pearl buttons. My mother wore it when she married, she said. I never had cause to. Johnathan looked up from where he was oiling the saddle. You sure? I wouldn't have brought it out otherwise. He stood, wiping his hands. Then let's not wait. They married under the cottonwood just past noon on the first clear day of March. Zeke wore his father's vest, too big through the shoulders, and held Zachary's hand while Georgia stepped barefoot into the snow-wet earth. The preacher from Rivermouth read the words with wind tugging at his coat, and Johnathan said his vows like a man laying down anchor. Afterward, Georgia leaned in close, her forehead resting against Jonathan's. I never thought I'd get to say it, she whispered, but I love you. He drew her in, his hand pressed to the nape of her neck. And I love you. With everything I've got. Behind them, the boys threw handfuls of pine needles in the air and laughed like the wind couldn't touch them. And for the first time in a long time, Georgia Ryland was not waiting for anyone. She was standing beside a man who had come on purpose, stayed with reason and chosen her not from duty, but from love. By late April, the meltwater had turned the creek behind the pasture into a steady ribbon, clear and quick over stone. The ground softened enough for planting, and Johnathan spent the better part of each morning breaking soil while Zeke marked rows with a length of twine and sharpened sticks. Georgia kept the kitchen garden to herself, saying she liked the quiet it gave her, the way her mind could settle between the onions and runner beans. One afternoon, she found an old row of rhubarb poking up near the henhouse, and her face lit with something close to wonder. Didn't think it had survived, she said, brushing the dirt from the red stalks. Last time it came up, Zachary was still crawling. Johnathan leaned on the fence post and watched her fingers work. Things take root if they're meant to. She looked up, and the breeze lifted a strand of hair from her cheek. So do people, I suppose. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, she pulled a tin box from beneath the floorboard under her bed. She carried it to the table where Johnathan sat oiling the hinges of the barn door he'd taken down earlier. This was mine before I married, she said, setting the tin down. It's not much. A few keepsakes, some coins my father gave me when I left Missouri. I never told Caleb about it. He set his tools aside and opened the lid at her nod. Inside lay a folded square of lace, a silver thimble, 2 brass buttons, and a tiny drawing of a house with a porch and a sycamore tree drawn in charcoal. "I used to think I'd build it myself," she said. "Hammer the nails, raise the frame. I didn't know what I was asking of myself." Johnathan ran a thumb along the edge of the paper. "Still might be worth building. Maybe." She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't found that letter?" He studied her face before answering. "I'd still be out there, somewhere between towns, chasing men who'd rather shoot from cover than face a debt. I think I'd have worn myself down to nothing." She nodded. "And now, I wake up with purpose. I know whose hands I'll hold before bed. I know what I'm building and who I'm building it for." She didn't speak right away. Then, after a moment, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "You're not what I expected, but I think you're what I needed." The next morning, Zachary stumbled into the kitchen with flushed cheeks and a bark of a cough. Georgia laid the back of her hand to his brow and frowned. "He's warm." Johnathan stepped in from the porch, wiping his boots. "I can ride to the widow Lafton's. She keeps horehound and willow bark. She'll have rose hips too if we're lucky," Georgia said, already spooning broth into a pot. Johnathan saddled up and rode east through the low hills. The widow's cabin sat past a creek ford where the trail narrowed and ran beneath a stand of poplars. She handed him a bundle of dried stems and a jar of syrup with a nod. "Tell Georgia to steep the bark first, then the hips," she said, "and keep the boy warm." By the time he returned, the wind had picked up again. He found Georgia rocking Zachary by the stove, his head tucked beneath her chin. Zeke sat nearby, quieter than usual, his eyes never leaving his brother. Johnathan handed her the bundle. "Widow said to start with the bark." Georgia nodded and rose, easing Zachary into Zeke's arms. "Talk to him," she said softly. "Even if he doesn't answer." Zeke nodded, holding his brother close. "I will." That night, after the tea had been steeped and the fire banked low, Zachary finally slept without coughing. Georgia stood at the doorway, arms folded, watching the rise and fall of his breath. "You're good with them," she said. Johnathan moved to stand beside her. "They make it easy." She turned to him. "You ever think about having more?" He blinked, then nodded slowly. "If it's with you." Her voice was low. "I think I'd like that." He touched her cheek, thumb tracing the line where her skin warmed. "Then we will." Outside, the stars hung low and still. Inside, soft breathing filled the silence, and in that quiet, something deepened, a thread woven tighter, not from duty or grief, but from the slow, steady making of a life shared. They left the tin box on the mantel, unopened since, but never forgotten. Georgia didn't need to draw the house again. She was already standing in it. By mid-May, the cottonwood leaves had come full, rustling low across the yard in the evenings while the boys chased each other barefoot through the grass. Georgia stood on the porch with her hand resting on the edge of her belly, the curve there just beginning to show. She hadn't said much when she'd told. Johnathan just taken his hand and placed it beneath her ribs, her eyes steady. He'd knelt right where he stood, forehead bowed, saying nothing until the wind shifted and carried the scent of lilac across the field. The days fell into length now, dusk stretching its fingers past supper and into the hour when fireflies blinked along the fence rails. Johnathan had taken a job helping Mr. Laird, who'd broken his leg after a fall from his hayloft. It meant long days off the homestead, but every evening he returned with sawdust in his cuffs and something sweet from the widow Lafton's kitchen tucked in his coat for the boys. Georgia began keeping an extra basin by the stove for washing the road off his hands. Sometimes she'd press her palm to his back as he leaned into the water, neither of them speaking. One afternoon, while Johnathan was still at the Laird place, Zeke slid a folded sheet of paper under Georgia's hand where she sat sewing a hem. "I wrote something," he said, not quite looking at her. She unfolded it and read the halting lines, a story about a boy who hunted a fox through the winter woods and found, in the end, a clearing warm with firelight and waiting faces. She read it twice before speaking. "Did this come from a book?" "No, I just thought it up." She looked up at him. "It's good, Zeke. You've got a voice." His ears flushed. "I didn't think you'd say that. You ought to write another." He watched her finish the hem, then asked, "Do you think Pa would have liked it?" She set the fabric down. "I think he'd be proud of the boy who wrote it." "I am." Later that week, when the first thunderheads rolled in from the west, Johnathan and Georgia laid out extra quilts and checked the roofline for leaks. Rain came hard that night, but the house held sound. The boys slept through it. Georgia didn't. She sat by the window in her nightdress, watching the sky flicker. Johnathan poured water into the tin basin, set it beside the bed, then crossed to her. "You all right?" She nodded, then shook her head. The rain used to mean waiting. Watching the creek rise and wondering what would wash away next, he crouched beside her. "What does it mean now? That I've got someone who'll patch what breaks, who stays." He brushed her knuckles with his thumb. "You're not waiting anymore." "No," she whispered. "I'm not." When the rain passed and the moon came out, he lifted her from the chair and carried her back to bed. Her hand curled at his shoulder. By early June, Zeke had started helping a man named Corbin at the smithy on Saturdays, trading labor for lessons at the forge. Zachary spent his mornings chasing barn cats and his afternoons trying to climb the windmill. Georgia swore she'd tie a bell to him soon as she could find the wire. Her cheeks had grown fuller, and her belly rounded beneath her apron as the days warmed. She moved slower now, but with a certainty that made Johnathan ache with pride whenever he watched her from the field. One morning, she pulled him aside while the boys were stacking kindling. "I heard from my sister," she said. "She's coming out next spring. Says she wants to see the land I wouldn't leave. You think you'll want her to stay?" "I think I want her to see that I was right to stay," she said, eyes soft. "To see how the boys laugh, how you look at me. She'll see all of it," he said. "Every bit." The birth came in the middle of harvest, when the pumpkins were stacked by the porch and the smokehouse was full. Georgia labored through the night, the midwife crouched at her side, Johnathan never letting go of her hand. When the child gave her first cry, it was Zachary who ran to fetch water, and Zeke who stood silent in the doorway, eyes wide. "She's perfect," Georgia whispered, her voice hoarse. Johnathan cradled the girl, his thumb brushing the downy hair along her temple. "She's got your mouth. She's got your steadiness," Georgia said. "Even now, look at her." The boys took turns holding her, careful and reverent, while the midwife packed her bag. Georgia watched them from the bed, her face calm. When the frost came back around, the house was full in a way it never had been. Laughter ran through the kitchen like a current, and the babies' coos filled the quiet spaces. Zeke brought home a carved rattle from the smithy, his hands blistered but proud. Zachary started sleeping with his sister's blanket near his pillow, swearing it helped him dream better. One night, just after supper, Johnathan pulled Georgia outside. The stars were out and the air was sharp with pine and chimney smoke. "I have something for you." She turned to him. "What is it?" He reached into his coat and brought out a small wooden box. Inside lay a ring, simple, gold, with a single braided line etched around the band. "I didn't have this the day we married," he said. "But I want you to have it now." She stared at it a long moment, then slipped it onto her finger. "It's warm," she murmured. "It's yours," he said. "Always." She leaned into him, her hand resting beneath his coat against his chest. They stood there, the house behind them glowing soft through the windows, the children safe inside, and the air around them quiet but full. The sky held no storms that night, just stars and the sound of her breath, and the weight of every quiet promise they'd kept.